Today we're going to talk about the train derailment in East Palestine, Ohio, and the Republican and media's response to it. And I have two interviews this week. I interviewed the U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, Ambassador Thomas Greenfield, about Biden's surprise visit to Ukraine, a snapshot of the Russia-Ukraine war at the one-year anniversary, and her response to Republicans who've adopted a pro-Putin stance. And I'm joined by the chair of the Wisconsin Democrats, Ben Wickler, to discuss the state Supreme Court race and what it'll mean for fair maps and abortion protections if the conservative nominee wins. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen, and you're watching No Lie. So I'm going to go into the politics of what happened in East Palestine, Ohio in a moment. But up front, I think it's important to note why we're in a situation where this can happen in the first place. And that is because the railroads are owned by wealthy owners who want no regulations, and the Republican Party's reason for being is to cut regulations. You're going to hear a lot of scapegoating from the right surrounding East Palestine. But remember what happened when the GOP was in control. The Trump administration rolled back safety measures for railways like regular safety audits and an Obama-era rule that required faster brakes on trains carrying flammable materials to prevent derailments and explosions. He ended a pending rule that would have required freight trains to have at least 2 crew members on board. Republicans urged the Federal Railroad Administration to expand the use of automated track inspection in the place of more effective visual human inspection. The Republican Study Committee proposed a cut to government funding to address chemical spills. On the environmental front, Trump's EPA rolled back almost every regulation it could get its hands on. Regulation to prevent chemical accidents, to assess whether safer technologies have become available. They implemented inadequate toxic substances legislation, withdrew requirements for companies to get third-party audits over the causes of accidents. And Trump's appointees were industry professionals whose sole goal was to weaken regulations on the very industry they were charged with regulating. And it's not even like Trump tried to hide this stuff. Here he is bragging at a ceremony about all of the regulations that he was able to cut.
Together, let's cut the red tape. Let's set free our dreams. And yes, let's make America great again. And one of the ways we're going to do that is by getting rid of a lot of unnecessary regulation. Thank you very much. Thank you.
He'd even tweet out stuff like this, quote, "I am continuing to get rid of costly and unnecessary regulations. Much work left to do, but effect will be great." Yeah, man, I'd say the effect is great. Finally found something Trump didn't lie about. When you cut regulation, then yeah, the effect is usually pretty noticeable. The deregulation during the Trump era was so wide-ranging and so obvious that even Fox's Steve Doocy acknowledged it on air.
Speaking of the White House, apparently regulations regarding train safety were changed during the Trump administration. This particular railroad and others lobbied President Trump to dismantle an Obama-era rule that would have required railroads to update their braking systems. And apparently the Obama administration had pushed for it to govern transportation of hazardous materials after about 500,000 barrels of crude were dumped. But ultimately, the Trump administration undid that and said the costs exceeded the benefits.
I mean, the very obvious fact is that these railroad companies have been pushing against regulation for years, and Republicans and Trump supported them. And so while we won't know until the investigation here is complete whether any specific regulations being stripped away were responsible for this specific derailment, the entire right-wing stance toward regulations is what landed us here. Imagine for a moment if, instead of spending years rolling back safety standards, Republicans had bolstered them. Think about the ways this could have been prevented if we weren't constantly wasting our time re-implementing regulations only to watch Republicans strip them away as soon as they take power. Like, if you want to talk about who's responsible here, it is the people whose job it is to regulate dangerous industries and yet opted instead to ignore that job because they were in bed with the executives who they were supposed to be regulating. And let's be clear, they know this. Republicans are not unaware of the fact that their entire governing philosophy has been to enable exactly this type of behavior. And so, to distract you from that, because that's what they need to do, Republicans have seized on this narrative that Joe Biden and the Democrats are yet again ignoring the forgotten people in the middle of the country.
East Palestine is overwhelmingly white, and it's politically conservative. More than 70% of the voters in the surrounding county supported Donald Trump in the last election. That shouldn't be relevant, but as you're about to hear, it very much is. Imagine if this had happened in, well, the favored cities of Philadelphia and Detroit. If this affected the rich or the favored poor, it would be the lead of every news channel in the world. But it happened to the poor, benighted town of East Palestine, Ohio, whose people are forgotten and, in the view of the people who lead this country, forgettable.
That's the issue they're trying to push. The Democrats, per usual, are ignoring small, white, conservative, forgotten towns. Not a word about the regulation and the coddling of wealthy railroad companies that actually caused this accident. That's all totally fine. The real issue is that Secretary Pete should have shown up sooner, that Biden should have gone to East Palestine. Should they have? Sure, that's a fair criticism, although I would argue that that is just about the farthest thing down the list in terms of what's important right now. I don't think most people who can't drink the water are worried about Secretary Pete's travel schedule. They're worried about the fucking water. They're worried about the air. And again, the reason that this stuff happens is because half of our government thinks that deregulating the railroad is the right thing to do. Like, it really is incredible to watch Republicans spend 4 full years bragging about cutting every environmental and safety regulation possible, and then turning around and blaming the Democrats for not fixing their mess fast enough. And by the way, let's not pretend that Biden did nothing here. He called Governor DeWine within hours of this derailment happening. Here's DeWine literally admitting as much.
Look, the president called me and said, anything you need. I have not called him back after that conversation. I will not hesitate to do that if we're seeing a problem or anything, but I'm not seeing it.
But beyond that, Pete standing there in East Palestine after the disaster is not to blame for what happened in East Palestine. What's to blame is that we've got a railroad industry that wants no regulation despite record profits, and we've got a Republican Party whose reason for being is to cut regulations. It's amazing that Republicans have no problem with any of that, but they're worried about the optics of a political walkthrough? That's effectively saying we don't care about the cause of this crash, but we care a lot about decorum, which is so transparently hackish. And look, none of this is to say that Pete's visit doesn't matter, because it does, and it shows the people there that the government is there to help. But there is no planet on which the after-the-fact visit is more important than stopping these things before they happen. Like, I'd much rather Pete didn't have to go in the first place because there were proper regulations put in place that would prevent these derailments and chemical spills. And yet, not a single Republican has looked at this and decided that it's worth changing anything at a policy level. Like, they'll scream until they're blue in the face about Pete. They can find some energy for that, but support regulations to prevent this from happening again? Introduce new regulations? Support the re-implementation of those regulations that were rolled back by Trump? Support fines for big railroad companies that avoid safety regulations? Require these companies to invest some of their record profits into safety? Nah, they're not concerned with any of that because it is all theatrics and zero substance. And the saddest part is that Republicans get away with it, because while they complain despite their own policies leading to this stuff, the media is helping them, carrying water for them and doing exactly what you think they'd be doing. There's a New York Times article from Jonathan Weissman titled, "In Fog of East Palestine's Crisis, Politicians Write Their Own Stories." Here's an excerpt. To Republicans, East Palestine is a symbol of something far larger and more emotional, a forgotten town in a conservative state like so many others in Middle America, struggling for survival against an uncaring megacorporation and an unseen government whose concerns have never included the likes of a town of 4,718 souls. Like, dude, Republicans run this town and the entire state of Ohio. They have a Republican mayor, a Republican governor, a Republican legislature, a Republican congressional delegation. If this is a forgotten town, the people who forgot them are literally the Republican Party. Like, I've lost the ability to tell whether the New York Times and the rest of the media are doing satire or not, because you could parody the very concept of both sidesism and it would literally be this take. Someone should tell the press in this country that Republicans have autonomy. They're allowed to fix things. They're allowed to govern. If they're in charge, it doesn't have to be the Democrats' fault when something goes wrong. These stories are just incredible. When something goes wrong in a blue city or a blue state, it's the Democrats' fault. But when something goes wrong in a red state, well, that state is just forgotten by this nameless, faceless, nebulous entity, which is totally, definitely not the Republican Party. Heads I win, tails you lose. The fact is that this will not be the last derailment, it will not be the last chemical spill, it will not be the last environmental disaster. But the reason that these things will continue to happen is because nothing is happening to prevent them from happening. Republicans aren't interested in fixing anything, but they'll sure jump at the chance to exploit a tragedy for some cheap political points. So the next time a Republican tries to take a cheap shot at a Democrat because they want their 5-minute cable hit on Fox, ask yourself where they stand on the issues that actually landed us here in the first place. And then ask yourself what substantive solutions they're willing to propose to prevent it from happening again in the future. Because you and I know the answer to both of those questions, even if they're too ashamed to admit it. Finally, before we get to the interviews, one bit of exciting news. I've started a Spanish YouTube channel. Democrats clearly have a problem reaching Spanish-speaking audiences, and our vote share among Spanish speakers is actually going down. I've spoken about how it's a problem, and so now I'm kind of putting my money where my mouth is and translating all of my YouTube content into Spanish. So, if you have friends or family members who don't speak English but still want to keep up with this stuff, please send them a link to my channel to subscribe. The link is right here on the upper corner of this screen. It's also in the post description, and it's on the main page of my channel. Or you can search using the handle Brian Tyler Cohen Espanol, Espanol. Okay, here's a preview of my interview with Ambassador Thomas Greenfield. All of this is happening at the same time that some Republicans have adopted an overt pro-Putin position, both politicians and conservative media members. What's your response to those people in light of what's happening in Ukraine?
What I've seen is strong bipartisan support for what is happening in Ukraine. There are some voices out there, but I also saw strong voices from the Republican side in support of Ukraine. There is a Ukrainian American representative from Indiana who has talked about the strong support. I've heard various senators, and I've met with them myself. And I'm hearing still strong bipartisan support for Ukraine. I think what the world will continue to hear is that our support is strong, we're committed, and the support is unified for the people of Ukraine. The Ukrainians is on the front lines of a war for our values, a war for democracy, a war that supports the UN Charter. They're standing up to a world bully on our behalf. We're not sending American troops on the ground. We're giving them moral support, and we're giving them equipment and funding so that they can be on the forefront of this fight.
And here's a preview of my interview with Wisconsin Democrats Chair Ben Wickler. What would it mean for maps in Wisconsin if Dan Kelly is elected?
So Wisconsin is currently in a doom loop. And what I mean is, Republicans in the state legislature have drawn gerrymandered maps to ensure that they'll be reelected. Every 10 years, there's a redistricting process, and what's supposed to happen is that the legislature proposes maps, the governor can accept or veto them. If they're vetoed, then you go to a court, and the court is supposed to kind of choose something that's a fair compromise. But in Wisconsin, unlike every other state, after Republicans in the legislature proposed their gerrymandered rigged maps, and our Democratic Governor Tony Evers vetoed those maps, the state Supreme Court just chose the Republicans' maps. So there's no way that voters could ever throw the bastards out. As the saying goes, there's no path for voters to say, hey, the Republicans have been screwing it up, let's elect Democrats for a change, because the maps are so rigged that even in a year like 2022, when Democrats won the governor's race by 3.4 percentage points, Republicans came within a hair's breadth of supermajorities, 2/3 of all the seats in the state legislature.
If you want to watch the full interviews with both Ambassador Thomas Greenfield and Ben Wickler, click the thumbnails right here on the screen or check out the interviews playlist on my channel. And as always, to see more of my content, click the link right here on the screen to subscribe.